Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. I'm Amy Carney. I'm a real estate counsel for Burlington Stores, and I am also the co-chair of the events committee for Crew Greater Philadelphia. I'd like to just take a moment to thank Crew Greater Philadelphia's sponsors. Without our sponsors, we would not be able to put forth all of the events and programming that we do. So you can see them. I'm just going to hide myself so you can see them on the screen here. And I'm just going to go over them very briefly. We have Brandywine, we have Dilworth Paxson, Capstan, Herman Miller, Wispas Bank, KSS, Becker and Frondorf, First American, Spectrum, Target. We also have Century Engineering. We have Land America, Fulton Bank, we have Brookfield Properties, Archer Griner, Irwin and Layton, NFI, Wick, Fisher and White. We have Kimley Horn, White and Williams, Fox Rothschild. We have the Harmon Group, Advantage Fitness. We also have Groundbreaker sponsors. We have Equus Capital, Greyhawk, JL Architects. We have NV5 Bach and Clark, Old Forge Builders, and Langen. And then for our affiliate sponsors, we have Reynolds Restoration, ServPro, Rethink Innovations, Hayworth, Crusher Miller, Office Depot. At the end here, I can't quite read it on my screen. And Flannery. I want to thank all of our sponsors for all of the support that they give us. If at any time during the webinar, if you have questions, please feel free to insert them in the chat, and we will try to get to them at the end of the presentation. So now I just wanted to turn to today's speaker, Mauro Guillén. I hope I say that right, Guillén. Is the Dean of the Cambridge Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge in the UK. He is a fellow of Queen's College at the University of Cambridge. He's the recipient of Fulbright and Guggenheim Fellowships, and he's an expert on international business, corporate governance, and digital platforms. He has earned awards from the Academy of Management, the American Sociological Association, and the Social Science History Association. He also won the Aspen Institute's Faculty Pioneer Award for his innovative curriculum that he designed as director of the Lauder Institute at the Wharton School at UPenn. Dean Guillén is here today to talk to us about the demographic, economic, and technological trends that are reshaping our world, and how we can understand these trends now to prepare for these global transformations that will be evident by the year 2030. These topics are discussed in Dean Guillén's book, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything, which is an international and Wall Street Journal bestseller. I turn it over now to you, Dean Guillén.
Oh, thank you so much for your kind introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me. I hope that my sound and the image is coming across the Atlantic clearly. If not, let me know. And you didn't mention that I moved to the UK about a couple of months ago, and that was after 25 years living in Center City, Philadelphia, and working at the Wharton School. So it's really like a homecoming, so to speak, for me today to be able to engage in, I hope, a conversation about what's going on in the world. And I'm going to be telling you about these trends that I see that I think are going to fundamentally reshape our world over about 30 minutes or 35 minutes. And then I would very much like to hear your questions, answer them, or also listen to whatever comments you have. And I'm going to be, essentially telling you quite a few things about women, because many of the trends that are going to fundamentally reshape the world over the next, let's say, 10 years or so, have to do with the kinds of decisions that women are making. I'm also going to be making some references to real estate, because I think there are quite interesting implications especially when it comes to how these trends that have to do with population, with the economy, with technology, have been accelerated by the COVID pandemic. So let me begin sharing the slides, and of course, I would be very happy to make the slides available to anyone. The title of the presentation is just the title of the book. So 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. But what I would like to essentially focus your attention today is that if you think about these population, economic, and technological trends in isolation of one another, then you're not going to be able to really anticipate the big transformations that are lying ahead of us. So the whole point here is to think laterally. That is to say, to see how these individual trends come together, how they converge, how they collide to produce, I believe, within the next few years, a very different landscape for all of us. So in other words, this is all about connecting the dots across those trends. And to the extent that you connect the dots, then I think you're going to be able to see some unanticipated effects, and you're going to be able to see the future so much more clearly. And look, there are essentially just a few things that have been going on in the world, which are going to be reaching critical levels over the next 10 years or so. So much so that the landscape by the year 2030 is going to be fundamentally different. The first thing that is going on, as I'm sure you realize, is that the number of babies being born has been dropping for a long time, pretty much everywhere in the world. So here you see a chart that begins on the left-hand side in the year 1950. It goes to the middle of the chart, the year 2020 with actual data, and then the rest are forecasts into the future. And very clearly, we're measuring something called the total fertility rate. So this is just the number of children born to each woman estimated over her lifetime. So considering the entire reproductive life of women. And as you can see in the different parts of the world, the number has been dropping pretty much since the last 40 years or so. So even in the least developed parts of the world, which is a dotted line, that would be Sub-Saharan Africa, that would be the Middle East, that would be South Asia. The number of babies has been dropping since the 1970s. The decline has been even more dramatic in the next tier of countries, which is a thin line. That's the less developed parts of the world. Those are what we otherwise know as the emerging markets. So that's China, that's India, that's Indonesia, Thailand, Turkey, Mexico, Brazil, and so on. And it also declined, of course, and that was the first part of the world where the decline was felt in the more developed parts of the world, like the United States, Canada, Australia, Europe, Japan, and so on. But there's something surprising about this chart that I would like to bring to your attention, which is that if you focus your vision now on the curve at the bottom for the developed parts of the world, I think you will be able to appreciate in the screen that beginning in the year 2000, there has been a slight increase in this number of babies estimated over a woman's lifetime, okay, reproductive lifetime. And the question, of course, is, isn't that surprising? How come that there has been apparently a slight reversal in the downward trend since the year 2000 in the United States, in some European countries? And well, yes, there is this effect here. And the reason, the primary reason is immigration. So big wave of immigration, immigrant families tend to have more babies. This in the end has had this effect. So hold on to that fact, because that is really important to understand something about what the world would look like, what the United States, what Philadelphia would look like in the year 2030, okay? So once again, declining the number of babies. Now, the other side of the coin, whenever we're talking about population, has to do with life expectancy. How many years are we expecting those babies to live? So here on this second chart, we have the same timeline. So we begin all the way to the left in the year 1950. We go to the middle of the chart to the end of 2020 with actual data, and then the rest are forecasts into the future. And very clearly, we're measuring life expectancy at birth. So a baby born in a particular year, you go to the corresponding curve and you see how many years on average that baby will live, depending on whether the baby was born in the poorest parts of the world, that dotted line is at the bottom, or in the more developed parts of the world, like the United States or Europe, and that's the line at the top. Now, once again, here the trend is unequivocal. Life expectancy is growing. I cannot make any promises to any one of you in particular, but those of you listening right now, you're going to live on average, maybe 5 or 6 years longer than your parents, and also on average about 10 or 11 years longer than your grandparents. But there's another surprising thing in this curve, which is really important for us to ponder, which is that I'm sure you can appreciate that the difference between rich and poor has been narrowing down over the last few decades. So back in the year 1950, the difference in life expectancy for a baby born in the least developed parts of the world, the poorest countries, or the richest countries, was about 30 years. Okay, that was the difference in life expectancy, which was a huge difference. But nowadays, in the year 2021 or so, the difference has come down to less than half, so only 14, 15 years of difference between a baby born in a rich country versus a baby born in a poor country. And the projection is that there will continue to be convergence. So in other words, what this means is that, yes, everybody's seeing life expectancy grow in the world. However, the poorest parts of the world are actually catching up in terms of the life expectancy. Their life expectancy is growing faster. So hold on to that fact as well, because it's also likely that it will have very important implications in the future. Okay, so far I've been telling you about two numbers, okay? And in a moment, in just 30 seconds, you're gonna see how those two numbers are going to change the world over the next 10 years, okay? So the first number we've been talking about is the number of babies per woman. The second number is life expectancy in years of those babies. So the first time that I drew the chart that I'm about to show you, and I saw it on my computer screen, I could not believe my eyes. I thought, quite frankly, that I had made a mistake. But I didn't make a mistake. So this is the most up-to-date chart with the latest information. So once again, we begin in the year 1950. We go to the end of 2020 with actual data. The rest are forecasts. Now, vertically, what we're measuring is what percentage of the world's population is in different parts of the world, right? In different regions or countries. Now, so that you can see the effect, I drew here a vertical line in the year 2028. The reason that the line is not in the year 2030 is because of the pandemic. The pandemic has accelerated these changes. And so what happens at the point where you see the blue line, vertical line, is that the curves start crossing each other. So what happens? By the year 2028, Africa will become the second biggest region in population in the world, for the first time becoming bigger than East Asia, which, by the way, includes China. So how did that happen? How is that about to happen? Well, that's going to happen for two reasons. The ones that we just mentioned. In Africa, the average number of children per woman is about 4, right? But not only that, those babies, as time goes by, are seeing their life expectancy grow faster than for babies born in other parts of the world. So it is the combination of those two things that is producing that result for Africa, right? Now, also by the year 2028, as you can see, the population, the share of the population in South Central Asia, which includes India, is going to level off. And also in that year, Europe, where I come from, I'm originally from Spain, Europe, that used to be the second biggest region in 1950, is going to fall to 5th or 6th place in the world. So the situation is going to be very different, right? Globally, we're going to see this dramatic relative shift in population away from East Asia, away from Europe, and towards South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, you might be wondering, how about the United States? Well, you see the United States over here. At the end, in the 1950s, the US represented about 7% of the world's population. Nowadays, it's only about 4.5%. By the year 2028, it will be only 4%. So not a big dramatic change, like the changes that you see on the chart for Africa, for East Asia, for Europe, but it's still important. Now, you may be asking yourself at this point, why should I care about this? What's in it for me? Well, I think whether we want it or not, we're all part of this world, part of the global economy, and these population trends will affect all of us, right? But let me bring this issue closer to home, to the United States and even to Philadelphia, okay? Let's examine the impact of these trends on how many people we have in different age groups, okay? So first, let's take a look at the younger age group, people between the ages of 15 and 35. So these are the consumers, the workers of tomorrow. These are the homeowners of the future. Okay, so what you have here on the table is how many millions of these people between the ages of 15 and 35 we have, or we had at the end of 2020, and how many there will be at the end of 2030, 10 years later. And we have on the table the largest countries in the world. For example, we have India, which is going to have even more people between the ages of 15 and 35 by the year 2030, the same as, for example, Nigeria, right? Then we have a second type of country like China. Look at China. They're going to have 60 million fewer people between the ages of 15 and 35 by the year 2030. That's a dramatic change. And then finally, we find another type of country, the United States, where, as you can see, the number is barely going to change. So nowadays, we have about 90.4 million people between the ages of 15 and 35. By the year 2030, we will have 89.5 million. So it's about the same. But here's the important thing. Remember, I told you earlier that immigration has made an impact. Not only that, we also have minority groups. Minority groups in the United States, Asian Americans, Latinx, African Americans, and so on. They also tend to have more children than the mainstream of the population. So here's the projection for the United States from the US Bureau of the Census, which is part of the federal government, as you know. By the year 2030, more than half of the people in the United States between the ages of 15 and 35 will be members of what today we call minority groups for the first time in history. Now that's really important, right? So in other words, for this younger age group of workers and consumers and home buyers, more than half of them are going to be what today we call minorities, meaning the minorities will become the majority. Okay, so does that matter? Okay, well, of course it matters. And it matters for a very, very important reason. Okay, so in the US, once again, the number of people between the ages of 15 and 35 will remain stagnant. Minorities will be the majority. But why does it matter? Why is it going to matter for real estate? Well, look, members of minority groups in the United States, they tend to marry at a younger age than the mainstream of the population, about 2 years early. Okay, not only that, adjusting for income level, this is important, adjusting for their income, members of minority groups in the United States are more likely to purchase a home and to purchase a car. So if we have a different distribution of people, right, by race or by ethnicity, by the year 2030, in this younger age group between 15 and 35, you can imagine that there's going to be implications because they behave differently. They marry earlier. And once again, adjusting for income, they're more likely to purchase a home or to purchase a car. And by the way, those are the three most important decisions that we make in our lives, right? Which is to marry or not, to buy a house, to buy a car. So in other words, the United States, the markets, real estate, it's going to change for starters because of this shifting composition of the population. But now let's go to the other end of the age distribution. People above the age of 60. Now, you've been hearing about population aging for the longest time. Look, the pandemic has only accelerated population aging. Why? Well, very simple. People thought that when we were in lockdown, we were going to have more babies out of boredom, perhaps. But that didn't happen. And it didn't happen for the obvious reason, which is that young couples, when they see that the economy takes a turn for the worse, when they anticipate that they might lose their job, or when they've actually lost their job, then they postpone making big decisions. And having a baby is a big decision. So a lot of young couples in the United States and around the world postpone having babies during the pandemic. In the United States, about 300,000 fewer babies than expected were born in the year 2020. Now think about it. If people, young couples, are postponing having a baby, then the population gets older faster, right? So in other words, the pandemic has contributed to population aging. Now, here in this case, if you go down the table, you will notice that every country in the world, it doesn't matter whether it's rich or poor, will have more people above the age of 60 by the year 2030. Look at China. At the same time that China will have 60 million fewer people between the ages of 15 and 35, they're going to have 110 million more people above the age of 60. In India, 50 million more people above the age of 60. In the United States, 15 million more people above the age of 60. Now, these people have different needs, right? Above age 60, 70, 80, 90. That's going to have a lot of implications for many things, but keep in mind the following two numbers. First, the largest consumer segment defined by age will no longer be people in their 30s and their 40s. By the year 2030, it will be people above the age of 60. Second number that I want you to keep in mind. In the United States, 80%, that's 80% of the net worth is owned by people above the age of 60. A lot of that net worth, by the way, is in the form of real estate. So in other words, things are going to change very fast as we see that progressively this age group, population above age 60, becomes the single most important one. Why is this happening? Again, very simple. Because each year for the last 50 years, we've had fewer babies. So the largest generation in US history is the one that is now in their 60s, in their 70s, in their 80s. It's as simple as that. And this is going to have major repercussions for consumer markets, for financial markets, for pensions, for Social Security, for all sorts of things, of course. But there's another way in which all of these changes are going to come together, right? And I want to offer this as a first example of lateral thinking. Look, for the last 150 years or so, we have been organizing our lives in terms of what I call the sequential model of life, which is first you play when you're little, then you study when you're in your teens or your 20s, and then you work, and then finally you retire. Now, I strongly believe that this way of organizing our lives is going to come to an end. Increasingly, more and more people are going to deviate from that sequential pattern. Why do I say that? Well, think about the following three trends and how they're coming together. The first one is that the lifespan is increasing. We've already talked about that. That's life expectancy. So today in the United States, 13,000 people are celebrating their 60th birthday. Those people can expect on average to live another 24 years. Now, 24 years is another lifetime beyond age 60. But the second big change is that the health span is also increasing. What is the health span? It's the period in life during which we remain physically and mentally fit. So today, a 60-year-old or a 70-year-old or an 80-year-old is in much better shape than a person of a similar age, let's say 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. So not only we live longer, we stay fit, mentally and physically fit for longer, for a greater number of years. And then the third big change, technology. Technology is changing everything. But in particular, technology is making whatever it is that we learn at school or in college, it's making that knowledge obsolete much faster than in the past. So if you put together the three trends, here's my forecast. My forecast is that in the future, people will go back to school several times. Why will they do that? Well, they will first go to school in their tweens, in their teens, in their 20s. Then they will work. By the time they celebrate their 40th birthday, they will realize that all of those things they learned at school or in college are perhaps less useful because technological change has rendered them obsolete. So they will decide to go back to school. But don't get me wrong. I don't think they're going to be checking into a dorm on campus. I think that they're going to be using a digital platform, such as the one that we're using right now, to learn new things. And then they will continue working. By the time they celebrate their 60th birthday, they will realize two things. The first is that they don't have enough money for retirement because, hey, they have another 24 years on average ahead of them. The second thing they'll realize is that whatever it is that they learned when they went back to school at age 40 has again become obsolete. So they're going to go back to school and then they're going to continue working, maybe on a part-time basis. Now, think about it also from the following perspective. If people go back to school, or a lot of people go back to school several times during their lifetime, there's nothing preventing them from pursuing a different career, occupation, or profession each time they go back to school. Now, this is going to fundamentally change everything, right? It's going to change the way in which we think about life. It's going to change the way in which we work. I think it's going to change also the way in which companies are organized and so on and so forth. Now, let me bring all of this closer to some of your daily preoccupations, which is all about real estate. Look, there's a big process that has been going on for 8,000 years in the world, which is the growth of cities. And cities represent only, as if we speak today, about 1% of the land area in the world. But they're home to about 60% of the population, and that proportion is growing. And they're responsible for 80% of carbon emissions. So at this point, I'd like to, mention for the first time climate change. I think climate change is a very important trend that we need to take very seriously. And look, there's no solution to the problem of climate change unless we fix the cities of the world, unless we make them less wasteful, unless we make them more energy efficient. Now, the important thing here perhaps will be, okay, we just went through a pandemic. A lot of people are now living further away from the downtown area because they want to engage in social distancing, but more importantly, because they can work remotely. So how is that going to change the process of urban growth around the world? Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that the growth of cities is essentially happening in parts of the world where perhaps the pandemic is not going to have the effect that it has had in the United States or in Europe. So let me just show you a few maps here. Back in 1970 in the world, there were only 3 cities with more than 10 million people. Okay, New York, Tokyo, and Osaka. I hope you can see the red dots. So Philadelphia is directly south from New York. At the time, had between a little bit more than 1 million people. Now, let's move now to the year 1990. Now we have LA, above 10 million people. We have Mexico City, Buenos Aires, and Sao Paulo. We have Mumbai and Kolkata. We have Seoul in South Korea. But it's still in the year 1990, no city in China or Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East with more than 10 million people. Hard to believe, but that was the situation back in 1990. Now, the situation today, roughly speaking, 2018, is that, well, there's been tremendous growth of cities in China, Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. That's where the growth has been taking place. And by the year 2030, this is the projection to the year 2030, look, we're going to have not 3, but rather 35 cities in the world with more than 10 million people. And not only that, we're going to have, in addition, another 450 cities above 1 million. So big changes. Cities continue to grow. I don't think remote work and social distancing will have such a big impact in Sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East or South Asia. I think cities will continue to grow there. Okay, so now, what are some of the implications of all of this for real estate? I referred already to remote work. I referred to social distancing. I've been referring to all sorts of other things. Well, I think that given what's going on, and especially how the pandemic has accelerated technology adoption, right? Because we have been forced out of necessity as workers, as students, as shoppers, to use technology during the last 18 months. I think the hard areas in in real estate, especially in Europe and the United States, will be the ones that you see on the screen. Distressed retail, last mile retail, so that is in connection to e-commerce, distressed office space, smart office space. I want to make a comment about that. So I think remote work is about to become smart work, meaning the key characteristic is not whether we work from the home or from the office, but rather whether we use technology to be creative, to be productive, to collaborate with others while working. And so I think that the big opportunity is moving forward, not just in office space, but in smart office space. Whether that space is in the home or whether that space is in the traditional or classic office building. Another hot area, of course, will be logistics. And then finally, because of climate change, green commercial and office space. So last 5 minutes here, if I may. And then once again, I would be so happy to see which questions you have or what comments you have about what I'm saying. So far, we've essentially been following the babies into the future, trying to understand how population trends are going to be reshaping things and thinking about how technology may also interact with those trends. But now I would like to ask you to, instead of following the babies, to follow the money in the world. And when you follow the money in the world, there's something very simple. Let's take a look first at the middle class. The middle class is so important. It's the bulk of the market, right? The richest countries in the world have a large and robust middle class. Well, as you see on this chart over here, the situation today, 2030, is that Europe and the United States, I'm sorry, 2020, Europe and the United States are starting to decline as a percentage of the global purchasing power of the middle class. And India and China are rising. So much so that by the year 2030, which is over here, Europe and the United States are going to be tiny compared to the purchasing power of the middle class in China, India, and the rest of Asia, even excluding Japan. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that in terms of real estate development, both residential and commercial, in terms of just everything that has to do with consumption of durable goods, emerging markets are going to be really, really important. But I also want to bring to your attention something surprising about this chart. If we continue beyond the year 2030 and we go to the year 2040, something really interesting happens, which is that by the year 2040, which is nearly towards the right end of the chart, you will notice that India around that year becomes a bigger market for middle-class consumption than China. So I frequently make presentations in front of audiences from China or audiences who understand China very well. And they push back. They tell me, Professor, you've got to be wrong. China is going to be #1 at everything. What are you talking about? And I always tell them, look, I mean, don't get too excited about China because you also have India, and it's a very large country. But India has two characteristics that stand out relative to China. First is they're having more babies. So eventually they're going to have a bigger population than China. But more importantly, if they're having more babies today than China, that means that the Indian population is going to be younger in the future. And that's why by the year 2040, in terms of consumption, India will be bigger than China because young people purchase more durable goods. What are the main categories of durable goods? Homes, automobiles, appliances for the home. That's where the big differences are. So if India has a greater number of young people, and it's also a larger population than China by the year 2040, India is likely to become the largest market for middle-class consumption. Now, the other big change in closing that I want to bring to your attention, and now we're going to talk about women, is the accumulation of wealth. So let's talk about the so-called high net worth individuals. These are people who have a net worth of at least $1 million, including real estate. Well, as you can see on this chart, the number of high net worth individuals, meaning millionaires, people who have a net worth in excess of $1 million, has been growing. So if you use the year 2008, the last global financial crisis, as your reference point, you will see that the number has more than doubled since then. We have in the world now 20 million people who are high net worth individuals. And in each part of the world, in each region, that number has increased. Now, second thing that I want to tell you about this is that, yes, the US continues to be the country in the world with the largest number of high net worth individuals. We have about 6.5 million, as you can see, all the way towards the right of the table, followed by Japan, Germany, China, France, the UK. No big surprises there. But here's what I really want to bring to your attention, something that I think is going to change the world over the next few years. Well, first of all, most of this wealth is concentrated in the upper age groups, as I mentioned earlier. So pretty much everywhere in the world, the number of high net worth individuals is greater among the higher age groups. The only exception is Asia Pacific, excluding Japan, where you can see that there's a third bar from the left. There's a significant proportion of millionaires who are below the age of 45. And that's because of China. In China, a lot of young people have made a fortune in recent years in real estate, in financial services, or in technology. But the most important thing for me, for the first time at the end of 2020, we had in the world more women who were millionaires, meaning high net worth individuals, than men for the first time. So in other words, women have been accumulating wealth in the world faster than men, in spite of discrimination. There's still discrimination on the job when it comes to promotions, wages, and so on and so forth. But in spite of that, women have been accumulating wealth faster than men. Now, why is that the case? Well, first of all, women now have better access to education. With better access to education come better labor market opportunities. Women, and more of them increasingly around the world, are making their own money. The second thing, really important for this, remember, wealth is concentrated in the upper age groups. The second important factor here is that, as you know, women on average live longer than men. Now, if women live longer than men, that means that at age 60, at age 70, at age 80, at age 90, there's progressively more women than men, because the men have been dying in greater numbers than the women. Well, because of the combination of those two forces, women now having better access to education and therefore to jobs on the one hand, and on the second hand, that women live longer than men on the other, we see this effect that women are accumulating wealth faster than men. Now, I think that is going to change the world. Forget about everything else. Forget about technology. If more of the wealth of the purchasing power of the world is in the hands of women, consumption is going to change, savings, behavior is going to change, and investing is going to change. And in closing, let me just summarize what some of those changes might be. First of all, women are more inclined than men on average to spend money on education, healthcare, and insurance. You see, the common thread across those three categories is the future. Women care more about the future. They want to be prepared for the future. Therefore, they're more willing to put money into education, not just for themselves, but also their children and grandchildren. More money into healthcare, perhaps also helping their parents. And also more money into insurance, because they prefer more comprehensive coverage on average. That's what the data indicates. Savings is also going to change, because women during most stages in life save a greater percentage of their income when relative to men on average, once again. And investing, you know that the finding always is that women tend to be more risk averse. They're also better investors because they don't switch as frequently their investments as men do. And therefore, they actually most of the time have better returns over the long run. So all of this is going to have really important implications. Let me just finish by saying, for folks like yourselves in your industry, what are the hot areas here to think about? Well, think about emerging markets with a growing middle class. You are in Philadelphia or in the Philadelphia area. You're focusing over there. But remember, the growth in the next few decades is going to come from emerging markets. Second, perhaps because of the concentration of wealth, luxury retail will be important. And finally, it's going to be really important for every company, no matter the industry, to pay very close attention to women's needs and wants. Once again, because the wealth of the world is shifting away from men and towards women. And those trends will continue in the near future. So thank you so much for your attention. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And I very much look forward to your comments or to your questions. I hope you're still there. Yes, you're there.
Thank you, Dean. That was a very interesting presentation, and I welcome any of our attendees. If you'd like to ask Dean a question, please feel free to insert it into the chat. I had a few questions for you myself, just based on the book and certainly the presentation. Do you have any thoughts on whether these trends will lead to people owning versus leasing real estate? Some of the things you mentioned were, immigrants coming in and they're more likely to purchase a home. But then you also have the likelihood that people are changing careers over time, which may lead them, across the country or even, across the world. And also just changing decision making, if women have less children, are they more likely to move? So just all of those things made me wonder if you had thoughts about sort of, are people still purchasing homes? Are they more likely to lease so they can move around?
That's such a great question. And I think you almost provided the answer, which is it's very difficult to generalize, right? Because it seems as if the trends contradict each other, right? So absolutely. I mean, if you have more immigrants, if you have more members of minority groups, especially in the younger age group, so these are the first-time home buyers, once again, their inclination is to buy rather than to rent. Once again, relative to the mainstream, right? So they aspire, their aspiration is to buy a home, to buy a car. They also marry earlier, right? And again, if you adjust for income level, you do see that they are more likely to purchase real estate, for example. So that's one trend in that direction. But as you correctly pointed out, if we go back to school several times, if we switch careers, maybe we'll also switch locations, and therefore maybe the benefits from home ownership will not be as appealing for certain categories of people in the future. So that from that point of view, the trend seems to go in the opposite direction. But then I would like to add just another dimension here, which is what age group are we talking about? And look, we have this process of wealth accumulation in general, right? Which is, of course, triggering higher levels of social inequality. But more importantly, once again, wealth, net worth seems to be concentrated, right, increasingly in the upper age groups, right? And remember, we're living longer, right? Each generation is living longer than the previous one. So two observations here that I think are worth thinking about, okay? And if you take them seriously, right, I'm sure you could spend an entire weekend just thinking about them, right? So the first is, what are the implications of this for younger people who in many countries don't have a stable job? They're finding it very hard to save money, right? As you know, savings among young people are at an all-time low. Therefore, they don't have money for a down payment, right? And so they then continue renting, continue leasing, right? So that's one aspect. But the other aspect is, once again, the net worth is concentrated among people about the age of 60 or 70 or 80. And a lot of that wealth for many families is in the form of real estate. So the big question, right, is what's going to happen with inheritance, right? Who's going to inherit what, right? And, there are two schools of thought, and with this I will end, right? And we'll go to the next question. One is that younger people are about to inherit a lot of money and a lot of properties. That's one school of thought. Once again, because a lot of the wealth is concentrated in the upper age groups, and eventually those people will pass away, right? Inevitably. But there's a second school of thought that says, well, but people are living longer. And not only that, people want to have in their 60s, in their 70s, in their 80s, a much more active lifestyle than people in preceding generations. So the big question, according to this second set of people, is how much of that money, of that wealth is going to be left for the heirs to enjoy, right?
Well, yeah, or will consumption
exactly right.
That?
Exactly right. Or will people in their 70s, 80s, 90s spend their money until the last check bounces, so to speak, right? So we still don't know. I think this is one of the biggest questions that I think is going to have a large impact on the real estate industry, the residential part of it, right? Huge
Absolutely.
impact in the future, right? So how much of that wealth that is owned by people above the age of 60, 70, 80 is going to be spent, and how much of it is going to be inherited by their children? I think that's a key aspect, right, of in all of this. And it's still probably too early to tell. But once again, what we have now is the baby boomers going into retirement, right? And they have wealth, right? They have net worth. So are they going to spend it, or are they going to pass it on to their children? Big question. We still don't know. It's too early to tell.
And arguably, e-commerce, I think, has made consumption, not necessarily in real estate, but in other areas, easier. So you wonder if, even for older generations, if it's difficult for them to travel, but you can purchase things from around the world by a click of a button. So does that, assist in that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question in the chat, by the way, in case you haven't seen it.
Okay. Yep,
Which
from
I think,
Emma.
yeah,
Go
do you
ahead.
want to
You want to
read
read
it?
it? I can read it.
Why don't you read it, and then that way it sounds as if,
It's a real
we're
question.
having a conversation.
Can you speak more to the definition of a smart office and a green office, and the types of changes that we can expect from traditional office spaces?
Yeah, so Emma, thank you for the question. And let me expand a little bit on it, because I was very cryptic earlier. So I think remote work is not going away, right? So we've gone, companies and individual workers, we've all gone through this huge experiment. We have learned how to work remotely. There are some downsides to remote work, of course, loneliness and burnout, very difficult to onboard new employees, and so on and so forth. So my sense is that we're going to be gravitating towards a future of work in which we're going to be implementing blended models, right? So we're not going to be at home all the time. We're not going to be at the office all the time either. But that's not enough. That's only about the location, right? Companies, and also I think individual workers, what they want is to be productive. They want to be creative. They want to enjoy. And so I think that the challenge now, not that we have experienced remote work, that we have experienced working through a platform such as the one that we're using now, the challenge and the opportunity is in smart work. So in a moment, I'll get to the smart office, but smart work. So how can we be more creative, more productive with virtual teams, for example, right? And there's some experience. Multinational corporations have been using virtual teams for quite a while. But now it's every company, right, has been operating with virtual teams out of necessity during the pandemic. So the issue now is, what are the lessons that we've learned? How can we do this in a way that, once again, we're more creative, more productive, more competitive, right? So my argument, or my belief, is that we're going to see increasingly smart office spaces emerging, right? So I'm not talking about WeWork or smart office spaces, not necessarily shared, but smart office spaces in the home and at the company's facilities, right? Where I think work is going to be organized in a different way. For example, knowing that some workers on a particular day will be remote while others will be in the location. Smart work that enables us to use technology, right, in a way that, we've never used. Because so far, I mean, all we've done is create cubicles, and then people work, they have a keyboard and a computer. But there's so many other technology applications that we could use, from virtual reality to, all sorts of things. So I think that's the trend, right? And I think sooner or later, real estate developers will realize that they either need to retrofit homes, or they need to retrofit buildings, or they need to, from scratch, create a new type of environment, both in the home and at the office, where people can be more productive in the use of technology, right? So that's the thing. And then the green office is, or the green home, of course, is related to climate change. So I think on top of everything else, I think there's going to be greater demand, greater pressure, I think, on the real estate industry to offer green buildings and green space, even much more so than over the last few years. I know that many of you probably take this very seriously already, but I think there's a lot of room for growth, for improvement in that area. So thank you, Emma, for your question. That's really good.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, helps is if people are going to go to the office, if it's a hybrid model, they want to be productive and they want to have an environment that is green and, has light afforded to them and doesn't have a big carbon footprint. So I think part of that is, employees will probably push that trend as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think both companies and employees, the change will come from both. Yeah. And you want to read the other question? There's another question in the chat.
Sure. So Maria is asking, you said COVID-19 accelerated these trends. If COVID-19 had not happened, what year do you think we would be discussing instead of 2030? She's trying to get a sense of the significance of the pandemic. Oh, great question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, for most of the trends that I've been examining, what I did was to recalibrate in the wake of the pandemic. And so before the pandemic, I was thinking that many of these trends will reach a critical level by the year 2030. And that's why I called the book, the title of the book is 2030. But now, once again, for the most part, the pandemic has accelerated these trends, right? And therefore, then, the future that I describe in the book, now I believe is going to be arriving maybe a couple of years earlier. And you saw in the specific example for population that the line was set, the blue line, vertical line was set at in the year 2028, which is a couple of years early, right? So, my only regret about the book is that maybe the title should be 2028 as opposed to 2030, right? So once again, I think this is the basic idea about this pandemic, and like other crises that we've had in the past, is that instead of putting things on hold, instead of derailing pre-existing trends, what the pandemic has done is put every trend on steroids, has accelerated everything, has exacerbated the trends. Once again, the most obvious example is technology use, right? I think we have come to use technology, especially digital platforms, over the last couple of years so quickly. Otherwise, it would have taken maybe 5 or 10 years, right, for us to get to this point. But then, you see this acceleration in so many other trends as well.
Absolutely. And as she's saying, but 2030 has a nicer flow than 2028.
I completely agree. I completely agree.
And I just had one other question for you, sort of related to what we were just discussing with the COVID-19 and the pandemic, all of these resulting supply chain issues affecting, manufacturing industries. And, do you think that the manufacturing will come closer to home because people realize it's not great when there's a pandemic affecting a country, far from us, and suddenly we can't get any materials?
Yeah, supply chains, right? And this is happening, of course, affecting big time the construction industry and real estate.
Yeah.
I should tell you that as we speak right now, my wife and I are actually renovating 2 apartments, right, that we own, right? So not just 1, but 2. So we're like talking to many of the people, I guess, who are listening, right? Architects and designers and contractors and so on and so forth. And one of the biggest problems that we are experiencing is that the materials that we choose, the tile, whatever it is, the fixtures for the bathroom, they're on back order, right? So what we've seen in the pandemic is a major disruption of global chains, supply chains. It's not the first time that this has happened. If you remember, the first big shock was nearly 10 years ago, the earthquake and tsunami in Japan at Fukushima, right? And that was devastating, right? But that only affected one country, and then, all of the customers of Japanese companies throughout the world. But then we had the trade wars, right? Before the pandemic as well, between China and the US, between the US and Europe, and so on and so forth. And that was another major disruption. And then came the pandemic. So in all 3 cases, you're absolutely right. The effect has been that companies are now stocking more, and they are rethinking their sourcing. Where is it that they source things in the world? And in general, they have tried to reduce the distance also. So instead of sourcing from China, sourcing from Mexico, let's say, right?
Okay.
So all of these things, once again, they were going on before the pandemic. because of disruptions such as the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, or because of trade wars. But once again, same thing, the pandemic has accelerated that because it added so many other reasons to the mix, essentially inviting companies to restructure their supply chains. So I think we're going to have to learn how to live with this, because this is not a problem that I think can be sorted out in just a year or two. I think we will continue to have supply chain disruptions over the next couple of years or so. And then hopefully, companies, especially logistics companies, will help. Now, can I add another thing, which I think is an important point about real estate? E-commerce. That's the other thing that has exploded during this pandemic, right? Now, e-commerce also changes the supply chains, especially the last miles, right, of the supply chain. Instead of people going to the store, they purchase online or they pick up and so on. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be a revolution in the so-called last mile real estate for shopping and for delivering things there. And then there's going to be another revolution in real estate in the back office in terms of storage and in terms of, all of the logistics of moving goods around. So I think in commercial real estate, there's going to be a revolution as well. Again, accelerated by this phenomenal increase in e-commerce as a result of the pandemic.
Absolutely. Well, Dean Guillén, I just want to thank you so much. It's just been a pleasure listening to you and hearing you and reading the book as well. We really appreciate your time. And I appreciate all the panelists, or the attendees that have joined us today to listen to you.
Oh, thank you for having me. And if people want to continue the conversation offline, you can find me on LinkedIn. We can become friends. That way we can update each other. I frequently post, articles or commentary or videos. So thank you so much for inviting me. And I wish I were in Philadelphia and we could have done this, in person. But thank you again for inviting me.
Absolutely. We appreciate it very much. Thank you to everyone.